Your mother made me promise I'd never tell you, but she's gone now, and I can't carry this alone anymore. That was the first thing Rosalind said to me, standing in the doorway of her house, before I'd even fully stepped inside, before we'd exchanged a single normal greeting, and it landed hard enough that I actually stopped walking, one foot still on her porch step, waiting for whatever was about to come next. I'm Beatrix, 29, and Rosalind had been my mother's closest friend for as long as I could remember. Close enough that I'd grown up calling her Aunt Rosalind despite there being no actual blood relation between us. My mother, Coraline, passed away 8 months ago after a long illness, and in the months since, Rosalind had checked in on me periodically, the way people do after a loss, small texts, an occasional lunch invite, nothing that felt particularly unusual until 3 days ago, when she called and asked, very specifically, if I could come visit her alone, no boyfriend, no cousins, nobody else, just me. I'd assumed, honestly, that she simply wanted company, someone to reminisce about my mother with in private, the kind of quiet grief processing that sometimes needs an audience of exactly one. I drove the 2 hours to her house that Saturday without much apprehension, prepared for tears, old photo albums, maybe some story about my mother from before I was born that I hadn't heard yet. What I wasn't prepared for was the specific, deliberate weight in Rosalind's voice as she said that opening line, standing there in her doorway looking older and more tired than I remembered, her hands actually trembling slightly around the mug of tea she was holding. Aunt Rosalind, what's going on? I asked, finally stepping inside as she moved aside to let me pass. You're scaring me a little. She led me into her living room, sat me down on the couch, and took a long moment before speaking again, the kind of pause that told me whatever she was about to say had been rehearsed, turned over in her mind for longer than just the past few days. I need you to understand something first, she said. Everything I'm about to tell you, I believed for years I was doing the right thing keeping quiet about. Your mother made me swear, more than once, that this would go to the grave with her. And for 8 months since she passed, I told myself that promise should just extend forever, that some secrets are better left buried out of respect for the dead. But I've realized, sitting with it these past few weeks, that keeping this from you isn't respecting her memory anymore. It's just protecting a lie that isn't mine to protect at your expense. My chest tightened hearing that, some instinctive part of me already bracing for something I couldn't yet name. What lie? Aunt Rosalind, just tell me. She set her tea down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at me directly, the way you look at someone when you're about to say something you know will permanently change how they see their entire life. Beatrix, the man you grew up believing was your father, Desmond, he's not your biological father. Your mother never told you the truth about who actually is. I sat there completely frozen, the words landing somewhere I couldn't process yet, my brain still trying to fit them into a framework that made any sense at all. Desmond had raised me, had been at every school event, every birthday, had walked me down the aisle at my wedding 4 years earlier before he passed away himself, just 2 years before my mother. The idea that he wasn't biologically my father felt less like new information and more like an assault on 29 years of lived experience. Every memory suddenly requiring some kind of asterisk I'd never known existed. That's not possible, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. They were married before I was even born. There's no way I would have known. Someone would have told me this doesn't make sense. Rosalind's expression was gentle but unwavering. Your parents were going through a rough patch about a year before you were born, a separation, brief, quiet. Nobody outside their closest circle ever knew about it because they kept it that private. Your mother had a relationship with someone else during those few months. When she and Desmond reconciled, she was already pregnant, and they made a decision together, the two of them, to simply move forward as though nothing had happened, to raise you as Desmond's daughter in every way that mattered, and to never tell you or anyone else the truth about your biological father. I felt something cold and disorienting settle over me, sitting there in Rosalind's living room, staring at a woman I'd known my entire life, realizing she'd apparently been carrying this specific, enormous piece of my own history in silence for almost 3 decades. Who is he? I asked, my voice steadier now, some part of me already understanding that whatever came next would matter far more than anything that had come before it in this conversation. My actual biological father. Who is he, and does he know about me? Rosalind hesitated, longer this time, and something in that hesitation told me the answer was going to be even more complicated than the revelation itself. His name is Alaric, Rosalind finally said, and something about the careful, deliberate way she pronounced it told me this wasn't just a name she was recalling from 30 years ago. This was a name she'd kept present in her mind, tracked, maybe even followed in some capacity over the years since. And yes, he knows about you. He's always known. That second part hit me even harder than the first. He's always known? Then why didn't he ever? I don't understand. If he knew I existed, why wasn't he ever part of my life at all? Rosalind took a breath, clearly steadying herself for the next part. Your mother made it very clear to him, right after you were born, that she wanted him to stay away completely. She and Desmond had decided together that raising you as his daughter meant a clean break from Alaric. No visits, no contact, nothing that might complicate the story they'd chosen to build. Alaric agreed to it at the time, mostly, I think, because he genuinely believed it was the right thing for you, growing up with a stable two-parent household instead of some complicated blended situation with a man who wasn't prepared to fight your mother's wishes. But he agreed to just, disappear? For 29 years? I could hear my own voice rising, some combination of grief and anger I hadn't expected finding its way into the question. Not entirely disappear, Rosalind said carefully. He and I stayed in touch, actually, over the years, though your mother never knew that, or if she suspected, she never said anything to me about it directly. He'd ask about you sometimes, how you were doing, what you were up to. I'd tell him small things, nothing detailed, just enough to satisfy what I think was a genuine, if distant, kind of caring he never fully let go of. I sat with that for a long moment, trying to process the idea of a man existing somewhere in the world, quietly checking in on fragments of my life through my mother's best friend for nearly 3 decades, never once reaching out directly, never once trying to actually be present in any way that would have meant something real. Why are you telling me this now? What changed, specifically, that made you decide to break a promise you kept for almost 30 years? Rosalind's expression shifted into something more pained. Alaric reached out to me about a month ago. He's sick, Beatrix. Seriously sick. The kind of diagnosis where doctors start talking in terms of months rather than years. And he asked me, directly, whether there was any chance he might be able to meet you before it's too late, even just once, even if you wanted nothing more from him than a single conversation. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me, the weight of everything compounding at once. A father I'd never known existed, a mother who'd apparently constructed an entire narrative of my origins that turned out to be false, and now, on top of all of it, a ticking clock attached to the one person who might actually be able to answer whatever questions I hadn't even known I had until 20 minutes ago. I need time, I said finally, my voice unsteady. This is Aunt Rosalind, this is a lot. I need to process this before I decide anything about meeting him. Of course, she said gently. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I just needed you to know the truth finally, and to know that the option exists whatever you choose to do with it. I've carried this long enough watching you build a life without ever having the full picture of where you actually came from, and I couldn't let him possibly die without at least giving you the chance to choose for yourself. I left Rosalind's house that afternoon in a kind of daze I hadn't experienced since the week my mother actually passed away. The entire 2-hour drive home spent replaying different fragments of memory from my childhood, searching for cracks I'd never noticed before, moments where Desmond's love for me had felt, in retrospect, maybe slightly more deliberate than instinctive, though I genuinely couldn't tell if I was actually remembering something real or simply constructing false significance. Out of ordinary memories now that I had new, disorienting context to filter them through. By the time I got home, I'd made one decision, at least, even if everything else remained completely uncertain. I needed to talk to someone who might actually know more about this than even Rosalind did, someone who'd been close to my mother during that specific period 30 years ago, before Desmond, before the reconciliation, before the elaborate, decades-long silence that had apparently shaped the entire architecture of my life without my ever knowing it existed. I thought immediately of my mother's older sister, my Aunt Genevieve, someone I hadn't spoken to much in recent years beyond the occasional holiday call, but who I suddenly, urgently needed to sit down with directly. I called Aunt Genevieve that same evening, my voice still not quite steady, and asked if I could come see her the following weekend, something important. I told her something about Mom. She agreed without much hesitation, though I could hear a subtle wariness creep into her tone by the end of the call. The kind of careful, guarded energy people get when they suspect a conversation is heading somewhere they'd rather it didn't. I spent that entire week in a strange, suspended state, going through the motions of my normal life, work, groceries, calls with my husband Desmond, no relation to the man I'd grown up calling my father. An odd coincidence of naming that had never once felt significant until that exact week, while privately turning over every piece of Rosalind's revelation obsessively in my mind. I found myself digging through old photo albums my mother had kept, searching for any trace of a man named Alaric, any photograph from that specific window of time 30 years ago that might have survived whatever careful curation my parents had apparently done to erase him from the family record entirely. I found almost nothing, which itself felt significant. There was a noticeable gap in my mother's photo collection from about a year and a half before I was born. Months that simply weren't documented at all in an otherwise fairly thorough album, as though that entire period had been deliberately excised, the photographic equivalent of the silence Rosalind had described. When I finally drove out to see Aunt Genevieve that Saturday, she greeted me with the same careful energy I'd heard over the phone, and once we were settled in her kitchen with coffee neither of us actually drank, I told her everything Rosalind had shared. I watched her face carefully as I spoke, and unlike Rosalind's controlled, rehearsed delivery, Genevieve's reaction was immediate and visibly uncomfortable, her hands tightening around her mug, her eyes dropping to the table before I'd even finished explaining. "She actually told you," Genevieve finally said, more to herself than to me once I'd finished. "I always wondered if she would, eventually. I told her years ago I thought keeping this from you was a mistake, but your mother was adamant, and it wasn't really my place to override her decision about her own daughter." "So you knew?" I said, something between relief and renewed hurt settling into the words. "You knew this whole time too." "I did," Genevieve admitted. "Your mother told me everything back when it happened, mostly because she needed someone to talk to during that separation from Desmond, and I was the obvious choice, being her sister. I met Alaric a handful of times myself, actually, during those months. He was a good man, from what I could tell, genuinely cared about your mother, seemed devastated when she decided to go back to Desmond and cut him out of the picture entirely." "Why did she choose Desmond over him?" I asked, genuinely curious now, needing to understand the actual shape of the decision that had ended up defining the entire architecture of my life without my knowledge. If Alaric was a good man, if she cared about him enough to be with him during that separation, why go back to a marriage she'd apparently already left once? Genevieve considered the question carefully before answering. It wasn't really about who she loved more, I don't think, though I know that sounds strange. Desmond offered stability, an existing marriage, a family structure already in place, a life she'd already invested years into building. Alaric, from what she told me at the time, was more uncertain, still figuring out his own career, not in a position, financially or otherwise, to promise her the same kind of security Desmond represented. And once she found out she was pregnant, I think the calculation just became even more practical. She wanted you to have the most stable life possible, and in her mind, at that particular moment, that meant going back to Desmond and simply erasing the complicated middle chapter entirely. I sat with that for a long moment, trying to reconcile the image of my mother as this careful, deliberate architect of a decades-long deception with the woman I'd actually known growing up, warm, present, seemingly straightforward in a way that had never once suggested she was capable of maintaining a secret of this magnitude for nearly 30 years. Did Desmond know the whole time that I wasn't biologically his? I asked, needing to understand exactly how much of my childhood had been built on a shared, deliberate performance rather than the innocent, unknowing love I'd always assumed defined our relationship. Genevieve nodded slowly. "He knew from the very beginning. He made the choice himself, alongside your mother, to raise you as his own in every possible way, and from everything I ever witnessed over the years, Beatrix, that choice was completely genuine. Whatever the biology says, that man loved you as though you were entirely his own, every single day of your life. I don't want you walking away from this thinking anything about that love was ever less than real." I appreciated her saying that genuinely, even as some other part of me continued turning over the enormous, disorienting fact that everyone in my family, my mother, Desmond, Rosalind, now Genevieve too, had apparently participated, to varying degrees, in constructing and maintaining a version of my own origin story that had absolutely nothing to do with the actual truth. "There's something else you should probably know," Genevieve said then, her voice dropping into something more hesitant. "About Alaric. About why your mother really cut him off so completely, so permanently, back then. It wasn't just about stability and practicality the way I made it sound. I felt my stomach tighten at that. What do you mean? What else is there? Genevieve hesitated, clearly weighing how much of this was actually hers to tell, before finally continuing. Alaric wasn't just some man your mother had a brief relationship with during a separation, Beatrix. They'd actually known each other for years before that, since before she even married Desmond the first time. He was someone she'd been genuinely, seriously involved with in her early 20s, before circumstances, family pressure mostly, pushed her toward Desmond instead. Your grandparents didn't approve of Alaric, thought he wasn't stable enough, didn't come from the right kind of family, all that old-fashioned pressure that used to dictate so much back then. Your mother chose Desmond partly because it was what her parents wanted, and Alaric, from what I understood, never fully got over losing her the first time. So when they reconnected during the separation, I said slowly, piecing it together, it wasn't some random affair. It was what, unfinished business? Something that had been sitting there for years? Exactly that, Genevieve confirmed. And honestly, from everything your mother told me at the time, those few months with Alaric during the separation were some of the happiest she'd ever described to me, before or after. She loved him, Beatrix, genuinely, deeply, in a way I'm not sure she ever quite felt for Desmond, even after going back to him. But she also felt an enormous weight of obligation, to her existing marriage, to what she believed she owed Desmond, to the life they'd already built together before the separation happened. When she found out she was pregnant, that obligation won out over whatever she felt for Alaric, and she made the decision to bury it completely rather than risk unraveling everything she'd already built. I sat with that revelation for a long moment, feeling something shift again in how I understood my mother, not just as someone who'd made a practical, calculated decision about stability, but as someone who'd apparently sacrificed a genuine, significant love in favor of obligation and family expectation, and then spent the next 29 years quietly carrying that choice in silence, never once letting me see even a trace of what it might have cost her. Did she ever regret it? I asked. Going back to Desmond instead of staying with Alaric? Genevieve's expression softened into something sadder. I think she did, in quieter moments, though she never said it outright to me more than once or twice over all those years. There was a night, maybe 15 years ago, when she'd had a bit too much wine at my place, and she mentioned, almost offhand, that she sometimes wondered what her life would have looked like if she'd been braver back then, if she'd chosen differently. She never elaborated much beyond that, and I never pushed, because I could tell it was a wound she preferred keeping mostly closed, even with me. I left Genevieve's house that evening carrying an entirely different, more complicated understanding of my mother than the one I'd walked in with, not just a woman who'd made a practical calculation about my stability, but someone who'd apparently loved deeply, sacrificed that love for obligation, and then spent nearly 3 decades quietly managing the consequences of that choice without ever once letting the people closest to her, myself included, see the full weight of what it had actually cost her. That night, unable to sleep, I finally opened my laptop and did something I'd been avoiding all week, searching Alaric's name directly, wanting to see, for myself, who this man actually was beyond the fragments Rosalind and Genevieve had offered me. It didn't take long to find him. He'd apparently had a modest but respectable career as an architect, based in a city about 4 hours from where I lived, married once, divorced about a decade ago, no other children as far as I could tell from what little public information existed about his personal life. There was a recent local news article from just a few weeks earlier, a small feature about a community building project he'd apparently helped design decades ago that was finally being restored, complete with a photograph of him standing in front of the building, older now, gray-haired, but with a face that struck me, staring at the screen in the dark, as carrying an unmistakable resemblance to certain features of my own that I'd never once thought to question the origin of before this week. I sat there staring at that photograph for a long time, feeling something shift, slowly, from disorientation into something that felt closer to genuine curiosity, and underneath that, something harder to name, a quiet, tentative pull toward a man I'd never met, who apparently, according to Rosalind, might not have much time left to actually meet at all. By the time I finally closed my laptop that night, I'd made a decision. I was going to reach out to Rosalind and ask her to arrange it. Whatever complications, whatever grief or anger I still needed to work through regarding my mother's decades of silence, I wasn't going to let this particular window close without at least trying to look, in person, at the face that apparently belonged to half of where I actually came from. I called Rosalind the next morning and told her my decision. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, and I could hear something in her exhale that sounded almost like relief, like she'd been genuinely uncertain whether I'd choose to move forward with this at all. "I'll reach out to him today," she said. "He'll want to know as soon as possible, given everything." The arrangement itself came together faster than I expected. A meeting set for the following Saturday, neutral ground, a quiet cafe in the city where Alaric lived, close enough to his home that he wouldn't have to travel far given his condition, but public enough that neither of us would feel trapped in some overly intimate, private setting for a first meeting this loaded with history. The week leading up to it passed in a strange blur. I told my husband everything, and he was steady and supportive in the way he always is, offering to come with me if I wanted, though I ultimately decided I needed to do this alone, at least the first time. I also, after a fair amount of internal debate, decided to tell my closest friend, Coraline, mostly because I needed someone in my daily life who actually knew what was happening, rather than carrying the entire weight of it silently the way, I realized with some discomfort, my mother apparently had for nearly 3 decades. I drove to the city that Saturday morning with my stomach in knots, running through different versions of how the meeting might go, whether he'd be warm or awkward, whether I'd feel some instant, undeniable connection or nothing at all beyond the strange biological fact of shared DNA. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, chose a table near the back, and spent those 15 minutes watching the door with an intensity that made my hands shake slightly around my coffee cup. When Alaric finally walked in, I recognized him instantly from the news photograph, though seeing him in person hit differently than any picture could have prepared me for. He was thinner than the photo suggested, clearly further along in his illness than the image had captured, moving slowly, carefully, but his eyes, when they found mine across the room, held an expression I wasn't quite prepared for, something between hope and terror, the specific vulnerability of a man who'd waited nearly 3 decades for a moment he'd apparently never fully believed would actually happen. "Beatrix," he said, his voice unsteady. Once he'd made his way to the table and settled carefully into the chair across from me. "I've thought about this moment more times than I could possibly count. I never actually let myself believe it would happen." I didn't know what to say at first, sitting there studying his face, finding, up close, even more of my own features reflected back at me than the photograph had suggested. The shape of my eyes, something in the line of my jaw that I'd always simply assumed came from my mother's side of the family. "I don't really know where to start," I admitted honestly. "This whole week has felt completely unreal." "I understand," he said gently. "I don't expect anything from you, Beatrix. I want to be clear about that from the start. I'm not here hoping to insert myself into your life as some kind of father figure this late. That ship sailed a long time ago, and I made my peace with that decision, or tried to, years ago. I just wanted the chance to actually see you, to know you even a little before I'm not able to anymore." Something about the plain, unguarded honesty of that statement broke through whatever careful distance I'd been holding on to walking in, and I found myself, over the next 2 hours, asking him question after question about himself, about who he'd been 30 years ago, about my mother during that period, about what he remembered of those months they'd spent together before she chose to go back to Desmond. He talked about my mother with a tenderness that matched everything Genevieve had described, careful, clearly still affected by memories decades old, but without any bitterness toward her decision, more a quiet, resigned understanding of the pressures she'd been under at the time. "I never blamed her," he said at one point. "I understood why she made the choice she did, even if it broke something in me for a long time afterward. What I regret most, honestly, isn't losing her. It's agreeing so easily to stay away from you completely. I told myself for years it was the right thing, giving you a stable, uncomplicated childhood, but there were plenty of moments over the years where I wondered if that was really the reason, or if it was just easier for me to convince myself of that than to actually fight for some place in your life." We talked until the cafe started closing around us, and by the time I finally drove home that evening, exhausted in a way that felt more emotional than physical, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected going in. Not quite the instant, overwhelming connection some part of me had braced for, but something quieter and, in its own way, more real, a genuine curiosity about this man and the life he'd lived, and a growing, unexpected desire to actually know him, however much time circumstances might allow for that. Over the following 6 weeks, I visited Alaric almost every other weekend, the drives becoming easier each time, less fraught with anxiety and more genuinely anticipated. Something I found myself looking forward to in a way that surprised me given how recently this entire situation had entered my life. We talked about everything during those visits, his career, his failed marriage, small details of his daily life now, but also increasingly deeper questions I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying about identity, about the parts of myself I'd never had context for, certain instincts or preferences that suddenly made more sense once I understood where they might have actually come from. He showed me old photographs eventually, kept in a small box he'd apparently maintained for decades, pictures of himself and my mother during those months together, young, clearly happy, in a way that matched everything Genevieve had described about that period being some of the happiest of her life. Looking at those photos felt strange and disorienting in a way I hadn't fully prepared for, seeing my mother, a woman I'd known my entire life as steady and reserved, looking so unguarded and joyful with a man who wasn't the father I'd grown up with. "She looks happy here," I said quietly during one of those visits, studying a photograph of the two of them at what looked like some kind of small outdoor gathering, my mother laughing at something just outside the frame. "She was," Alaric said simply. "We both were for that brief window of time. I've thought a lot over the years about what might have been different if she'd chosen to stay, but I've also come to understand, especially now with more time than I'd like to admit left to think about these things, that dwelling on alternate versions of the past doesn't actually serve much purpose. She made the choice she made, and whatever came of it, it gave the world you, which is something I'll always be grateful for, regardless of how complicated the path to actually knowing you turned out to be." Around the fifth visit, Alaric's health took a noticeable turn, the kind of decline that made each subsequent visit feel more precious and more urgent than the last. I found myself rearranging my work schedule to see him more frequently, sometimes just sitting with him quietly while he rested, other times managing longer conversations when he had the energy for them, slowly building, in a compressed and strange timeline, something that resembled the relationship we might have had all along if my mother's decisions 3 decades earlier had unfolded differently. During one of those final, longer conversations, he told me something that reframed even further how I understood the entire situation. "I want you to know," he said, his voice weaker than it had been just weeks earlier, "that I never resented Desmond, even knowing he was raising you as his own. From everything I ever heard about him secondhand, through Rosalind mostly, he sounds like he genuinely loved you the way any father should. I'm grateful for that more than I think you probably realize. It would have been so much harder to accept staying away if I'd believed you were being raised by someone who didn't cherish you properly." I felt tears come at that, thinking about Desmond, about the specific, uncomplicated love he'd given me my entire life despite knowing, from the very beginning, that I wasn't biologically his. "He was a wonderful father," I said. "I don't think anything about finding out about you changes that, honestly. It just adds this whole other layer I never knew existed." "That's exactly how it should feel," Alaric said gently. "I'm not trying to replace anything, Beatrix. I never was. I just wanted the chance to exist in your life a little, even this late, even knowing our time is going to be short." Alaric passed away 11 weeks after that first meeting at the cafe, peacefully, according to the hospice nurse who called me that morning, with Rosalind present at his bedside, since I hadn't been able to make it in time from the 4-hour drive once his condition suddenly worsened overnight. I felt the loss more deeply than I expected, given how brief our actual relationship had been, but there was also something underneath the grief that felt strangely like gratitude, that I'd gotten those 11 weeks at all, that Rosalind had made the difficult, complicated choice to break a 30-year promise before it became too late for any of this to happen. I gave a short reading at his funeral, something I never could have predicted needing to do just a few months earlier, standing in front of a small gathering of people who'd known him throughout his life, most of whom I was meeting for the first time, distant cousins, old colleagues, a handful of close friends who apparently knew, in broad strokes, about a daughter he'd never been allowed to raise but had apparently spoken about, quietly, over the years, more than I'd fully appreciated until that day. In the months after Alaric's funeral, I found myself returning again and again to a question I couldn't quite settle, whether I was angry at my mother for the decision she'd made all those years ago, for the entire architecture of silence she'd apparently constructed and maintained for nearly 3 decades, right up until her own death, without ever once giving me the chance to know the truth while she was still alive to answer my questions directly. I talked through it extensively with my husband, with Coraline, and eventually, in a conversation I hadn't fully planned but found myself needing anyway, with Rosalind again, sitting in her living room in almost the exact same spot where this entire journey had started months earlier. "I keep going back and forth," I told her. "Some days I understand completely why she made the choice she did, the pressure she was under, the genuine love she apparently felt for Desmond even alongside whatever she felt for Alaric. Other days I just feel this deep, specific anger that she took the choice away from me entirely, that I spent 29 years not knowing something this fundamental about my own life because she decided unilaterally that I didn't need to know." Rosalind considered that carefully before responding. "I think both of those feelings can be true at the same time, Beatrix. Your mother made a decision decades ago under a specific set of pressures that felt overwhelming to her at the time, and she never found the right moment or the right courage to revisit that decision as you got older, even when circumstances might have made it easier to tell you the truth. That doesn't make the decision right, necessarily, but I don't think it makes her a villain either. I think it makes her human, someone who made a choice under difficult circumstances and then found herself trapped by the weight of maintaining it for far longer than she probably ever intended when she first made it." I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed, slowly working my way towards something that felt less like resolution and more like a genuine, complicated peace, the understanding that my mother had been a fuller, more complex person than the version of her I'd known growing up, capable of deep love, difficult sacrifice, and, ultimately, a decades-long silence that had cost me something real, even if I could also, eventually, understand something of why she'd chosen it. I kept in touch with a few people from Alaric's side of things after the funeral, distant relatives mostly, people who'd known him casually but who seemed genuinely pleased to have some ongoing connection to the daughter he talked about, quietly over the years, more than any of us had fully appreciated until his final months made that quiet, long-carried love suddenly visible. Genevieve and I grew closer too, in the aftermath of everything, our relationship shifting from the somewhat distant, holiday call dynamic we'd settled into over recent years into something more genuinely close, built on the shared weight of a complicated family history we'd now processed together directly, rather than in the fragmented, second-hand way it had originally reached me through Rosalind's revelation months earlier. I visited Alaric's grave for the first time on what would have been his birthday, about 4 months after he passed, bringing flowers, sitting there for a long while in a quiet that felt appropriate given everything, the strange, compressed, complicated relationship we'd managed to build in just 11 weeks after 29 years of complete absence. I found myself talking to him a little out loud, something I hadn't expected to do, telling him about small, ordinary things from my life since he'd been gone, work, small updates about Autoline and my husband, nothing profound, just the kind of casual updating you'd give someone you actually wanted to keep including in your life, even after they were no longer there to hear it directly. "I wish I'd had more time," I said quietly, sitting there in the late afternoon light. "But I'm glad Aunt Rosalind finally told me. I'm glad I got to know you at all, even this late, even for such a short time." Driving home that afternoon, I thought about the specific, strange chain of events that had brought me to this point. A midnight feeling conversation on Rosalind's porch that had started with a confession, unfolding over months into an entirely new understanding of where I actually came from, who my mother had really been beneath the steady, familiar version I'd grown up with, and ultimately a relationship, however brief, with a man I never would have known existed if Rosalind had chosen, as she'd apparently considered doing for years, to simply let the promise she'd made my mother extend forever, into permanent, unbroken silence. I understood, driving home that day, why she'd finally decided to break it. Some truths, however painful, however disruptive to the version of your life you thought you understood completely, matter more in the light than they ever could have mattered staying buried, and I was, despite everything the past several months had cost me emotionally, genuinely grateful she'd finally found the courage to bring mine into it. It's been almost a year now since Rosalind first opened her door and told me she couldn't carry the secret any longer, and looking back at everything that's unfolded since that afternoon, I find myself thinking less about the shock of the initial revelation and more about everything that grew out of it. The 11 weeks with Alaric, the deeper relationship I built with Genevieve, and, most unexpectedly, a slow, ongoing process of understanding my mother more fully than I ever had while she was alive to explain herself directly. I found, going through some of her old belongings a few months ago, boxes I'd left mostly untouched in storage since her death, a small stack of letters tucked into the back of an old jewelry box, never sent, addressed simply to dated across several different years spanning most of my childhood and into my adulthood. I sat on my living room floor reading through them one evening, and what I found inside reframed my understanding of my mother's silence one final time. The letters weren't romantic in any dramatic sense, mostly small, quiet updates, the kind of thing you'd write to someone you cared about but couldn't actually contact, describing moments from my childhood, my first day of school, a science fair I'd apparently won in 4th grade that I barely remembered myself, my wedding day 4 years earlier, described in careful, loving detail despite the fact that she'd apparently never had any intention of actually sending these words to the man they were written for. One letter, dated just a few months before her diagnosis, read simply, "I think about telling her the truth almost every year around her birthday. I never find the courage. I tell myself I'm protecting her, protecting the family we built, but some nights I wonder if I'm really just protecting myself from having to explain a choice I've never fully forgiven myself for making. Maybe someday I'll find the courage. Maybe I'll run out of time first." Reading that letter, sitting alone on my living room floor almost a year after her death, I finally understood something I don't think I could have fully grasped without everything that had happened since Rosalind's revelation. My mother hadn't simply made a cold, practical calculation 30 years ago and moved on without a second thought. She'd carried the weight of that choice, quietly, painfully, for the rest of her life, writing letters she never sent to a man she never let herself fully stop loving, running out of time, exactly as she'd feared in that letter, before she ever found the courage to tell either of us the truth herself. I brought the letters to Rosalind not long after finding them, and we sat together reading through several of them, both of us quietly crying at different points, two people who'd loved my mother deeply now finally understanding the full, complicated shape of a burden she'd apparently carried entirely alone for nearly 3 decades, never even sharing the depth of it with the one friend who'd known the underlying truth the entire time. "She should have told you herself," Rosalind said finally, setting down one of the letters. "I've thought that for years, honestly, long before she passed. But reading these, I think I understand now why she never could. I don't think it was really about protecting you or protecting Desmond, not entirely. I think somewhere along the way, telling you the truth became tangled up with having to finally admit, out loud, to herself and to you both, exactly how much she'd given up, and exactly how much regret she'd been quietly carrying underneath everything else. I understood that now too, in a way I couldn't have without this entire year of unraveling, meeting Alaric, losing him again so quickly after finally finding him. Reading these letters my mother never had the courage to send. Grief, I've come to understand, doesn't always move in a straight line, and sometimes the people you love most leave behind entire hidden architectures of feeling that only become visible once they're gone, pieced together slowly by the people left behind trying to understand who they actually were beneath the version they presented every day. I visit both graves now, my mother's and Alaric's, usually on the same afternoon, a strange but oddly fitting ritual that's developed naturally over these past months, bringing flowers to both, sitting with each of them separately, telling them both, in my own quiet way, about the life I'm continuing to build in the aftermath of everything they never quite found the courage to build together themselves. My husband asked me recently, gently, whether I thought I'd made peace with everything, the entire year's worth of revelations and grief and complicated, compressed relationship building. I told him honestly that I didn't think peace was quite the right word, not fully, not yet, maybe not ever completely. What I have instead feels more like understanding, a fuller, more complicated picture of where I actually came from, built not from a single clean truth but from fragments, Rosalind's confession, Genevieve's memories, Alaric's own account, and finally, my mother's own words, unsent but preserved, waiting decades to finally be found and read by the one person they were actually always meant for. I think, in the end, that's what Rosalind gave me that afternoon on her porch, not just a fact I'd been missing, but the chance to eventually understand my mother, fully, completely, in a way I never could have if that particular secret had simply gone to the grave alongside her, unspoken, the way she'd originally intended it to stay forever.